The morning smells like sulfur before any cannon has been fired. It is somewhere in the Caribbean, somewhere in the first quarter of the 18th century, and the sun has barely separated itself from the water when the men on deck begin to move differently. Not faster, not louder, differently. There is a ritual happening. A wooden cup passes from hand to hand. Each man who takes it drinks without ceremony, without toast, without eye contact. Some of them wince. Some do not. Then they go back to checking their weapons, and the wince fades, and something else moves into their faces instead. A flatness, a kind of stillness that looks almost like calm but is not quite the same thing. The ship closing in on the horizon does not know what is in those cups. But it is already too late for that information to help. What those men are drinking is not rum. Not exactly. It is something more deliberately engineered for what is about to happen. It is gunpowder mixed into rum, a concoction with no polite name and no place in any tavern, something brewed for violence specifically, something consumed at the edge of a particular kind of commitment. And the reason it existed, the reason it spread from ship to ship and crew to crew across the golden age of Atlantic piracy, tells us something we have largely forgotten about how those men prepared their minds for the moments their lives required. To understand what gunpowder and rum actually did, to the body, to the psychology, to the social architecture of a pirate crew, you have to understand first what pirates were actually afraid of. Not death, not specifically. Death was ambient in that world. It came from scurvy, from infection, from storms that split a vessel before any enemy ship was within 100 miles. The specific fear that haunted a pirate crew in the minutes before a boarding action was not dying, but losing the nerve to begin. The moment of engagement, when the gap between your ship and another began to close to the point where there was no turning back, when the grappling hooks were in hand and the pistols were primed and you were about to vault over a rail onto a deck full of men who were trying to kill you, that moment required a particular calibration of the human mind that does not come naturally to most people. The body does not want to do what a boarding action requires. The body understands, rationally or not, that this is a terrible idea. What the gunpowder drink was designed to do, or at least what it functionally accomplished, was short-circuit that instinct at the crucial window. The alcohol addressed the immediate anxiety. The gunpowder, and here is where the history becomes genuinely strange, was believed to do something more. Sailors and pirates of this era operated inside a belief system about the human body that blended observation with folklore in ways we now struggle to pull apart. They had watched gunpowder burn. They knew what it did to men from the outside. And the transference of that energy inward, the idea that consuming it would somehow store that explosive capacity in the body, that it would make a man more combustible, more sudden, more capable of the kind of violence that battle demanded, was not treated as metaphor. It was treated as fact. This is important. The drink was not primarily theatrical. It was not drunk to look dangerous, though that was certainly a byproduct. It was consumed because the men who drank it believed it worked. And that belief is the first real mystery in this story, because the truth of what it actually did physiologically and psychologically is far stranger and more nuanced than either the myth or the simple dismissal of the myth suggests. The gunpowder itself is not toxic in the quantities used. Black powder is composed of potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur, none of which, in small amounts mixed into a drink, produce immediate catastrophic harm. What they do produce is a powerful sensory experience, a bitterness at the back of the throat, a faint heat that has nothing to do with the alcohol, a taste so distinctly associated with weaponry and burning that the brain begins to treat the act of drinking as functionally contiguous with the act of fighting. The line between preparation and action blurs. The body is primed. Whether that priming was chemical, psychological, ritual, or some compound of all three is a question historians and medical scholars have argued across multiple centuries. What is not in dispute is the result. Men who drank this mixture before a battle fought differently than men who did not. And the captains who handed those cups out, men like Blackbeard, like Bartholomew Roberts, like the commanders whose names the historical record half-swallowed, understood that distinction precisely. The drink was not incidental to how piracy worked. It was structural. But the world that made this ritual necessary, that world is already beginning to close in on itself. And the window in which gunpowder and rum could exist as a serious instrument of combat psychology is narrower than it appears.
To understand why that window was narrowing, you have to understand what kind of men were actually drinking from those cups, and what kind of violence they had already survived long before any battle began. The popular image of the Golden Age pirate is a creature of freedom. A man who chose the sea, chose the flag, chose the life. The reality is considerably darker and considerably more interesting. The overwhelming majority of men who ended up on pirate vessels in the early 18th century did not begin there. They began in the Royal Navy, or in the Merchant Marine, or in the colonial labor economy, and they arrived at piracy through a sequence of compressions, each one narrowing their options further, each one making the next step feel less like a choice and more like the only remaining direction. Naval life in this period was not service. It was closer to managed captivity. Sailors were impressed, taken by force off merchant vessels or out of port towns by naval press gangs who had legal authority to do exactly that. Once aboard a Royal Navy ship, a man could not leave. He was paid irregularly, fed badly, flogged for offenses that an officer could define with almost total discretion, and expected to fight when told to fight and die when circumstances required it. The men who ran the Navy understood that this system produced resentment. They did not particularly care, because they also understood that the alternative, a volunteer Navy paid fairly and treated decently, would cost more than the British Crown was willing to spend. What this system also produced, without intending to, was a large population of men who had been taught violence professionally, who had lost any meaningful attachment to the institutions that governed their lives, and who had very little left to protect. When those men mutinied, and mutiny was not rare, or when they were discharged after a war ended and the Navy suddenly had no use for them, or when a merchant captain treated them badly enough that jumping ship in a foreign port became preferable to another month under his command, they did not simply disappear. They moved laterally into piracy, into privateering, into the grey legal spaces where maritime violence was sometimes sanctioned and sometimes not, depending entirely on who held the relevant paperwork and who was in a position to check it. This is the population from which pirate crews were largely assembled. Not adventurers. Survivors of systems that had already stripped most conventional fear out of them. Because conventional fear requires something to lose, and these men had been methodically relieved of most of what they had. Into this context, the gunpowder drink arrives not as an exotic curiosity but as a logical development. Think about what the ritual accomplishes beyond the physiological. A crew preparing for a boarding action is a collection of individual nervous systems, each one running its own private calculation about survival. Left to operate independently, those nervous systems will produce a ragged, uneven response at the moment of engagement. Some men hesitating, some men moving too fast and too far ahead, the collective timing that makes a boarding action survivable fracturing at exactly the moment it most needs to hold together. The drinking ritual functions as synchronization. When every man on deck lifts the same cup, tastes the same violent compound, performs the same act at the same moment, those individual nervous systems begin to operate more like a single system. The ritual is doing what military drill does, reducing the gap between intention and action by repeating the pathway between them until it becomes automatic. The drink is the trigger. The battle is what the trigger was built for. Blackbeard understood this with unusual clarity. Edward Teach, or Thatch, depending on which account you trust, is the figure in this history who took the psychology of the gunpowder drink furthest, most deliberately, most theatrically, and most effectively. He is also the figure who understood better than almost anyone else of his era that fear, properly managed, is more efficient than firepower. His preparations before an engagement were not accidental. The slow-burning fuses he wove into his beard and lit before a battle produced smoke that curled around his face in a way that contemporary accounts describe with a consistency that suggests they were not exaggerating. It was genuinely terrifying to face. The gunpowder rum was part of the same architecture. He drank it. He ensured his crew drank it. And then he presented himself at the rail of his ship as a figure who appeared, to the crew of whatever vessel he was closing on, to be something that ordinary violence might not reliably stop. This was strategic. A merchant crew that surrenders without fighting costs. Blackbeard nothing, no men, no powder, no time, no blood. A merchant crew that has to be boarded costs him all of those things. The entire performance was designed to make surrender feel like the rational option, which in most cases it was. But what Blackbeard also knew, and what the history of this period confirms, is that the performance required the performer to actually believe it. A crew that drank and doubted was a crew that hesitated. The ritual only worked if the men inside it took it seriously. If the gunpowder in the rum meant something real to the men consuming it, not just something theatrical to the men watching from the other deck. That is what made this particular instrument of combat psychology so fragile. It depended on a specific kind of belief, held by a specific kind of man, shaped by specific conditions. And those conditions, by the second decade of the 18th century, were already beginning to change faster than the drink could adapt. The year 1718 is not a turning point that announces itself. It does not arrive with a single battle or a single law or a single execution that everyone present understands as definitive. It arrives instead as a series of pressures, each one individually survivable, collectively terminal. A slow tightening of the world around the men who had built their lives inside its loosest spaces. By 1718, the British Crown had made a calculation. The calculation was not moral. It was economic. Atlantic trade had expanded to the point where piracy was no longer a nuisance that could be absorbed into the cost of doing business in the Caribbean. It had become a structural threat to the entire commercial architecture that the empire depended on. The sugar trade, the tobacco trade, the slave trade, all of it moved through waters that pirate crews had spent the better part of 2 decades treating as open territory. Merchant losses were no longer acceptable. The Navy, which had been contracting since the end of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1714, was now being redirected with specific intent. The Act of Grace issued in 1717 was the first formal signal that the window was closing. It offered a pardon to any pirate who surrendered before a specified date, a clean legal slate, all crimes forgiven, in exchange for retirement from the profession. The Crown did not issue this offer out of mercy. It issued it because mercy was cheaper than a prolonged naval campaign, and because it would divide pirate communities by separating the men who still had something to return to from the men who did not. It worked. Partially. Some men took the pardon. Some of those men kept it. Others took it, waited for the administrative attention to move elsewhere, and returned to sea within months. The Crown had anticipated this too. The second response, when it came, was not another pardon. What followed was a suppression campaign that operated on 2 levels simultaneously, and understanding both of them is essential to understanding what happened to the gunpowder drink and the world that had made it necessary. The first level was military. Naval patrols increased in frequency and reach. Governors in colonial ports who had previously tolerated piracy, sometimes enthusiastically, sometimes because the alternative was having their own shipping raided, were placed under direct pressure from London to close their harbours to pirate vessels and to cooperate actively with naval pursuit. The informal networks that had allowed pirates to resupply, sell their prizes, and recruit new men in port towns from Nassau to Charleston began to constrict. A pirate crew that could not resupply could not operate indefinitely. A pirate crew that could not sell its prizes could not pay its men. The economics of the profession were being deliberately dismantled, one harbor at a time. The second level was psychological, and it was in some ways more devastating than the military pressure. The Crown understood, even if it did not articulate this explicitly, that piracy in this period was sustained as much by mythology as by material conditions. The mythology was precise, that pirate crews were ungovernable, that their captains were supernaturally dangerous, that engaging them directly was a risk no rational naval commander would choose if an alternative existed. Blackbeard's theatre, the smoke and the gunpowder rum and the deliberate cultivation of his own legend, was not merely personal vanity. It was the operating system of a particular kind of power that depended on the enemy's imagination doing most of the work. The Crown's counter-strategy was to kill that mythology at the source. The death of Blackbeard in November of 1718, in the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet off the North Carolina coast, was not simply a military engagement. It was an information operation. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy sailed into that inlet knowing what a successful outcome would mean beyond the immediate tactical result. The account of the battle that was subsequently circulated, how many times Blackbeard was shot before he fell, how many sword wounds he absorbed before his body acknowledged what had happened to it, was not embellished arbitrarily. It was shaped to prove a specific point, that the thing which made Blackbeard appear indestructible was not real. That gunpowder rum and burning fuses and the accumulated weight of his legend could not, in the end, stop a naval officer who had decided not to be afraid of him. Maynard had Blackbeard's head cut from his body and hung from the bowsprit of his sloop for the return voyage. The symbolism was not subtle, but it did not need to be. It was aimed at an audience that understood exactly what it meant. The man who had most completely embodied the mythology of the Golden Age pirate had been killed, his body dismembered, his head displayed as a trophy. The ritual that had made him terrifying, the drink, the theater, the cultivated reputation for supernatural resilience, had failed at the moment it was tested against a prepared and committed opponent. This is the point where the gunpowder drink begins to separate from its function. The drink itself did not disappear immediately. Rituals rarely do. Men continued to mix powder into rum in the years that followed, continued to consume it before engagements, continued to invest it with the same meaning their predecessors had. But the conditions that had made it genuinely effective, the specific social world of the early 18th century. Caribbean, the specific population of men who believed in it completely, the specific military and legal environment that gave piracy enough operational space to develop its own psychology, those conditions were being systematically removed. A ritual that depends on belief is only as durable as the world that generates that belief. And the world that had generated this one was now in the final stages of being dismantled. Harbor by harbor, execution by execution, decapitated head by decapitated head. Bartholomew Roberts, who would become the most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age by almost any measure. More ships taken, more wealth accumulated, more sea miles covered than any of his contemporaries, watched all of this happening and made a different calculation. He did not abandon the gunpowder drink. He institutionalized it. He wrote it, in effect, into the formal governance structure of his crew. Roberts was unusual among pirate captains in the degree to which he committed the rules of his operation to writing. The articles that governed his ships specified how prize money would be divided, how disputes between crew members would be resolved, what compensation an injured man could expect for the loss of a limb or an eye. They also specified, with a directness that tells us everything about how seriously he took the psychology of his crew, the conditions under which men were expected to be ready for battle and the substances that would be part of that readiness. He was running out of time. He simply did not know it yet. Bartholomew Roberts died on the 10th of February, 1722, and he died the way he had lived, in full theatre, on deck, dressed in a crimson waistcoat and a hat with a red feather, a gold chain around his neck with a diamond cross hanging from it. He had been drinking. The accounts do not specify what, but given the man and the moment, it is not a difficult inference. When the grape shot from HMS Swallow caught him in the throat, he was standing at the rail of his ship, the Royal Fortune, watching the naval vessel close on him through the early morning haze off the coast of West Africa. His crew found him slumped against one of the guns. They threw his body into the sea before the naval boarding party could reach it, weighted with his arms and his finery, which was exactly what he had instructed them to do if it came to that. It had come to that. With Roberts gone, the golden age of piracy did not linger. It simply stopped. The infrastructure that had sustained it, the tolerant governors, the complicit merchants, the legal grey zones inherited from the era of privateering, had been methodically closed off over the preceding 4 years. The men who had crewed the great pirate vessels of the early 18th century were hanged in batches, their bodies gibbeted in iron cages at the entrances to harbours as permanent warnings to anyone considering a similar career. The Royal Navy had solved the problem it had been assigned, and it had solved it with a thoroughness that left almost nothing behind. Almost nothing. Not quite nothing. The gunpowder drink outlasted the world that invented it, the way certain tools outlast the specific problems they were designed to solve. It migrated. It adapted. It appeared in the accounts of naval engagements through the rest of the 18th century, used now not by pirates but by sailors in legitimate naval service, which tells us something important about what the drink actually was beneath the mythology attached to it. It was not specifically a pirate technology. It was a human technology, a solution to the problem of preparing a mind for controlled violence that transcended the particular legal status of the men employing it. The Royal Navy's own relationship with rum was by this point already formalized. The daily rum ration, grog, diluted with water and sometimes lime juice, was a structural feature of naval life, a tool of morale management that the Admiralty understood and deliberately maintained. What the Gunpowder Edition represented was the sailor's own unauthorized modification of that system. An escalation triggered by specific circumstances, a way of marking the transition between ordinary time and battle time that the official ration did not provide for. It persisted in this form: informal, situational, outside official sanction, through conflicts that would have been unrecognizable to the men who first developed it. There are accounts from the American Revolutionary War, accounts from the Napoleonic campaigns at sea, accounts from engagements in which the ships and the flags and the political objectives had changed completely, while the cup passing from hand to hand on a gun deck remained almost identical to what it had been 70 years earlier on a pirate sloop in the Caribbean. What does not change, across all of these accounts, is the function. Men drink it when they are about to do something their bodies would prefer not to do. Men drink it when the gap between where they are and where the next few minutes will require them to be is wide enough to need bridging. The gunpowder is almost incidental by this point. The quantities are too small to produce any reliable physical effect, and the men drinking it know this, at some level, the way people who engage in any ritual know that the mechanism of the ritual is less important than what the ritual does to the person performing it. This is where the history of the drink becomes something more than a curiosity about pirate behavior, and becomes instead a window into something fundamental about the relationship between human psychology and the preparation for violence, a relationship that military institutions across every culture and every era have had to negotiate, and have negotiated in ways that are more similar to each other than the surface differences suggest. Every military tradition in recorded history has developed some version of this technology. The specifics vary enormously. The Norse berserkers consumed substances, possibly henbane, possibly Amanita muscaria, possibly combinations of plants whose exact identity historians still debate, that produced a dissociative state specifically associated with combat. Greek soldiers drank wine before battle in quantities that modern military doctrine would find alarming. Aztec warriors engaged in ritual fasting and specific ceremonial preparations designed to alter their psychological state before an engagement. The Zulu impis used a combination of ritual movement, song, and plant-based stimulants. The forms are different. The function is identical: create a reliable pathway between the ordinary state of a human being and the extraordinary state that combat demands, and make that pathway reproducible under pressure. The gunpowder and rum ritual sits inside this universal human problem as one specific, historically bounded solution. What made it distinctive was not the ingredients. What made it distinctive was the precision with which it was calibrated to a specific kind of man, in a specific kind of situation, facing a specific kind of violence. Pirate boarding actions were not battles in the conventional military sense. They were intensely personal, confined to the space of a ship's deck, decided in minutes rather than hours, and resolved almost entirely by the willingness of one group of men to close with another group of men at close range and maintain that contact through whatever happened next. There was no artillery support, no reserve line to fall back to, no tactical option that involved distance. The men who won these engagements were the men who could compress the hesitation out of themselves most completely, most reliably, most quickly. The drink was engineered for exactly that compression. It did not need to make men brave in any abstract sense. It needed to make them fast in the specific sense of reducing the interval between the moment the order came and the moment the body moved. The alcohol reduced anxiety. The gunpowder, through whatever combination of pharmacological and psychological mechanism actually operated, sharpened the sense of committed purpose. The ritual itself, repeated in the same form each time, trained the nervous system to treat the act of drinking as the signal that the hesitation period was over. It worked because the men who used it believed it would work, and because that belief was not naive, it was based on observation, on experience, on the accumulated testimony of men who had been in enough engagements to know what helped and what did not. And then the world that had required it closed, and the men who had perfected it were hanged or pardoned or simply grew old on shore somewhere, and the drink passed into the informal oral tradition of maritime culture, half remembered, half mythologized, its original precision lost beneath the layers of legend that accumulated over it. What remains is this: somewhere in the early 18th century, in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic trade routes and in the shallow inlets of the American coast, a group of men who had been failed by every institution their world offered them built something functional out of what they had available. They built a psychology of combat from rum and sulfur and ritual and repetition, and it worked well enough that their enemies eventually had to kill them carefully and display their bodies publicly to prove it could be done. The gunpowder in the drink was almost beside the point. What the drink contained, ultimately, was the decision to stop being afraid of the next few minutes, to treat the approaching violence not as something happening to them, but as something they were choosing, deliberately, with full commitment, having already paid the internal cost of that choice before the first shot was fired. That is what passed from hand to hand in those wooden cups, on those decks, in those last years before the world closed in and took the whole era down with it. That is what they were drinking.